Hi there, Matt Squirrel here. Hope you guys are doing well. I hope everyone is staying safe this year. It's been a crazy time. This video is long overdue. I have not, for the life of me, been able to get this out any sooner than right now, just due to just absolute insanity here. But this is a special occasion, and I did want to share this with you on a very personal note. But 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of World War II, which had a very personal impact on our family. With the passing of time, many wartime stories and accounts are often lost in the shuffle or overlooked. There have been plenty of films, there have been documentaries, maybe you've had grandparents in your life that have served during the World War. But in the end, generations transition, and those experiences, stories, and wisdom are left to the younger generations to share. Thus, I'm here. But every one of these stories is valuable. And today I'm going to be taking a walk with you in this video through my Gram Squirrel, my grandma, Gram Squirrel's stories, and her personal scrapbook photos from when she served. So let's dip into the history first to begin, because we got to start at the beginning, obviously, right? But on May 8th of 1945, World War II in Europe came to an end with the unconditional surrender of Germany. It marked the end of the long war within Europe. Now, the war in the Pacific ended shortly after, with the Emperor coming on the radio in August of that same year of 1945, announcing their surrender after the dropping of the two atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan did their official surrender, however, on September 2nd of 1945. Here's some stock photos of that. These are not from Gram's scrapbook, although I'd be questioning her if she was there. Let me just say that. But Gram actually, when the war first started, which a lot of people attribute that for our involvement in World War II to Pearl Harbor. My Gram had just finished nursing school, and Pearl Harbor occurred in December of 1941. So, because of that timing, she needed more necessary training and experience to serve, so she did gain this very quickly after working numerous hours at John Warner Hospital, Mayo General Hospital, and throughout other hospitals located there in Illinois. But my Gram went on to join the American Red Cross, and immediately that within the same month she enlisted in the U.S. military, U.S. Army. So after that, she began the processing and training required of her deployment. These are some pictures from her albums of my Gram in her uniform at different places working and training and getting prepped. Gram bounced from her originating state of Illinois to several other states before being stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. And at Fort Lewis, she got her bigger chunk of training. These two photos here on the left, you see the hospital. To the right, you see their, I guess, lack of better words, the apartments or quarters for the nurses where she resided. So Gram was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington on October 13th of 1944. She was 26 years old, and she reported to duty at the 374th State Hospital in Fort Lewis, Washington. Now, during this brief time she had at Fort Lewis, Gram wrote home to the family, always describing, how things are going, how's military life. She was keeping her mom updated, which her mom indirectly was sharing those experiences with the local paper because that's what they did back then, even though that was kind of against the whole loose lips sink ships, and that ticked off my grandma. But anyway, long story. But in one of the stories that my grandmother did share, she described seeing a small Asian boy that was handling their trash pickup. Now, Gram was really confused as to why this little boy would be picking up trash. She couldn't understand why he wasn't in school. How did he end up being on base doing such a task? Trying to put two and two together. She just didn't understand why he was there. Gram shared with me later on about this because it always stuck out to her and it bothered her because she had no idea why he was there. And she was upset by seeing such a young child being put to work like that. She said he wasn't treated well, in her opinion. But It was much later on, she said, that she started to realize and had heard about this and then read about it, was that Japanese Americans, regardless of their citizenship, were being placed in internment camps throughout the country. But she was on the West Coast, and it was just more prevalent there, I guess. So Gram shared with me her feelings on it, saying that this was unconstitutional and it made no sense why we would do this to American citizens during wartime. Regardless of their race or ethnicity, she didn't understand why they would do this. But she said no one cared. No one questioned it. And she goes, war blinds people. It changes them. And that did upset her. But she realized that there was a lot of things that the American people weren't told, much less their military members. So I don't think Gram could really fathom this kind of hypocrisy to do something that the enemy would do. Something that she did carry this with her well into her older years. But it was wartime, and that state of mind kind of sticks with you. So it wasn't long before she was promoted from a second lieutenant to a first lieutenant and was cleared for her deployment. And she was sent to San Francisco on December 18, 1944, and from there she was sent to Hawaii onward to her actual post. Now, for many years, Gram held to the story that she was stationed in Hawaii, okay? And that wasn't the case, even though her mother had spread the truth in the local paper there. My grandmother hung on to the old phrase, loose lips sink ships, and this was deeply ingrained in her for all the reasons of saving American lives, obviously because Pearl Harbor was the biggest example of this. Therefore, for years, she always stuck to her story of remaining in Hawaii for deployment. This didn't add up at all on my end because of her photographs, some of the stories, and her friendships that she made. She made lifelong friendships when she was deployed. She eventually confided about Tinian Island and her time served there, but it wasn't something she volunteered by any means. Now, this is a stock photo of Tinian Island, and I do want to kind of go over a little bit of history without getting too off the track. But Tinian Island is located in the Western Pacific, part of the Mariana Islands, and this was a very strategic location for winning the war. The island was previously occupied by the Japanese, but this is a little bit of history about the island. In 1914, after the start of World War I, Japan exercised control of the northern Mariana Islands. The League of Nations gave control of the islands to Japan in 1920. Saipan became the center of Japanese occupation with over 30,000 Japanese residents. I will have all the links to all of these pieces of information in the description bar, and you can check those things out. But this island was very strategic for the war in every sense of the word. Now, this is from the historical branch of the Marine Corps' university website. You can see the citation and description for this. But, quote, only 3 miles away, the island's nearness, referring to Tinian. The nearness of Tinian to Saipan made its capture essential. Tinian's relatively flat terrain was ideally suited for the construction of airfields for the new American B-29s, and the Japanese had already constructed several runways at Ushi Point. American control of Tinian would put the home islands of Japan within striking distance of U.S. bombers. The defense of the island was under the command of Kiyoshi Ogata, with 9,000 Japanese troops. Like many of the Mariana Islands, Tinian was populated by native populations there, such as indigenous people known as the Chamorros. Let me say it properly. Chamorros, a Spanish-Filipino background of indigenous people, as well as numerous Micronesians of all types of colonial, like a little bit of everything together. But their treatment while they were under Japanese occupation was brutal. And whether this was in Guam, one of the other Marianas, Saipan, or Tinian, it was all well known of the occupants that they were to serve Japan regardless of their former leadership or their traditions, and failure to do so led to all the atrocities. I won't get into all of that here, but there will be links in the description about the history there. So, basically, the United States needed this island. So during the 9-day Battle of Tinian, which was July 24th until August 1st of 1944, the island base was taken by the United States from the Japanese. and this was the big step in the war campaign against Japan. So, Gram Squirrel makes her appearance on January 20th, 1945. She reported to duty on the island of Tinian on the northern Mariana Islands. She was now 27 years old. Gram turned 27 in October. She would remain there until the end of the war, so she was assigned to the 374th Station Hospital as a surgical supervisor. This particular hospital had just been established in late January 1945, so she actually arrived when this hospital had just opened. So 1 month after the arrival of the 374th hospital, where Gram was at, the hospitals on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian began receiving battle casualties from Iwo Jima. Over 18,000 casualties arrived within a single month. After Iwo Jima was secured in late March, there was another campaign that followed shortly after. For the Allies, the island of Okinawa was the last step towards the main islands of Japan. But Okinawa was fiercely defended, and within 3 months from April to June of 1945, more than 50,000 U.S. soldiers, sailors, and Marines were wounded, and 15,000 were killed. Casualties sustained during the Okinawa campaign were evacuated to Guam, Saipan, and Tinian via plane and hospital ship. Where Gram was at, the nurses stationed on those islands worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. Many patients arrived always in severe shock, hemorrhages. Some had sustained multiple wounds, and many required traumatic amputations. Nurses assumed responsibilities handled by doctors in the United States. They gave transfusions, debrided, dressed wounds, removed sutures. Nurses also trained wardmen to give infusions and change dressings, duties traditional reserved for nursing personnel. So the roles were multiple for these nurses. These were full-fledged trauma nurses. So it's incredible, because when you're thinking of all the things that these individuals were going through, whether it be the soldiers, the volunteers for Red Cross, the enlisted nurses that were in the Army Reserves, but they were enlisted in the U.S. Military, they were all seeing these things happen around them. And this was like a full-fledged experience in the highest sense of the word. What you're seeing here is a photo on the left from Gram's scrapbook. This is a view of the airfields there on Tinian. In the far distance, you can see Saipan's mountain is Assumption here. One of the mountains on there. I think it's the largest one on the island, which we'll have another photo here coming up. But this is a point of perspective photo she had taken of the airfields at a distance. On the right side with the arrow, that is my Gram. This is the day they arrived. And yeah, we did talk a little bit. I talked a lot about the photos with her too, but she always had little anecdotes, stories like that. But she had a very interesting perspective. This is from her scrapbook as well. I cleaned this up and added this in here. But this is the view from Tinian looking towards Saipan. And it's really a beautiful photo. I'm not sure, however, if this is the Mount Tapachau, or Tapachau. That is one of the largest mountains on Saipan. I'm not sure if that's that mountain, but I would like to assume that is. But we can go from there. But Gram had shared several stories of her time while she was on the island. Here's a photo of Gram and her best friend June. They were lifelong friends. On the left side there, these are cleaned and colorized, but that is Gram on the left side with her best friend. And on the right side, this is some of the local natives there on the island. A lot of times they would go out under heavy supervision, these particular nurses, and tend to the local villages, whether that was with inoculations or general health care. And it was a good thing. Gram did speak fondly of those times. She said that she loved children, so it was really difficult to see what difficult squalor that they were left with after the occupation, after the war that had happened with the Battle of Tinian. There was just a lot of things that went on, and a lot of death, and a lot of fear. And the inhabitants were either grateful or frightened or angry. It was kind of like a mixture between the three, because they didn't know what to expect from these invaders. And the road ahead for recovery for these islands is still going on to this day, from everything included. Just between whether it was World War I, World War II, dealing with all the occupations. Even under the U.S. occupation, and being in territories and so on. It's still a process. So, yeah, this is some of her photos. Here's another set of photos of Gram. The one on the far left, she's standing with some guys. Gave her a hard time about that, and Gram told me something about going to hell. I'm not sure what that meant, but because I would tease her. I'm like, what are you doing with all these good-looking guys? But she's in the middle, tallest one there. Gram was a big woman in height. She was an Irish lady. That is my Gram. But that's her on the middle there. In the middle photo, that's her in the middle with the two girls, and they're all three of them hanging out. They tried to make the best of the times when they were not working long shifts. On the far right, another picture of Gram with her best friend June. And, she had a lot of anecdotes and stories about her times. But the reality of war was always there. She didn't share for a little while in her life, I would say. She didn't start sharing with me the more graphic stories. And I understood why she waited, because I don't think I would have been prepared, to be honest with you. But as she got older, she definitely started sharing, and I'm going to get into that here now. Now, because the island had this massive runways just all over the place, especially, this was a very strategic island for the war. You had tons of planes that would come in all the time. And for Gram, this was a reality every day. And you get used to seeing hundreds of planes lined up on the runways. There was constant activity day or night. So it wasn't uncommon for such planes to make emergency landings on base. B-29s were in their heyday after all, so you had tons of these massive planes, which we will get a little more into. But this picture on the left here that you're seeing, that was from her scrapbook. This is cleaned up, obviously, and presented a little bit better to see, but it's called Hope-Ful Devil, and yes, it's named after Bob Hope. And this was a replacement B-29 for a previously downed aircraft that had a mechanical malfunction upon liftoff. It crashed on base, and it killed everyone on board. That was the Rook Girl B-29. So Hope-Ful Devil was the replacement plane. And she mentioned it in passing but did not elaborate. She didn't like to give too many details. Maybe it was a combination of loose lips sink ships, and also too, generally speaking, time had passed. And maybe she had kind of repressed a lot of stuff. But on the right side here, this is a stock photo of the West Field on Tinian, just to give you another aerial perspective of what it looked like from above. And it was huge, huge. It's just unbelievably large, airfields on either side of the island there. But they had missions of B-29s and other aircraft 24/7. So as mentioned, this was the best location for aerial planning and assaults against Japan. But she went on to share a story with me about a particular B-29 that did go down. She did not name the plane, and a lot of this, I believe, had a lot to do with wanting to keep it private for the instilled respect to the families and those that were killed. So, but this memory was very vivid in her mind, even early into her 80s. So, Gram says, there were numerous planes that would come in with wounded servicemen and injured pilots, but the most difficult ones were the planes that crash landed. B-29s are these large planes that would crash land, and crashes weren't uncommon with so much air traffic and different assignments, missions coming in and out. But there was one particular crash that was the worst I had seen. This plane, carrying at least a dozen men, missed the runway, killing everyone on board. As nurses, we were on that tarmac immediately after, picking up body parts for hours, trying to locate dog tags, identification for these soldiers so they could be returned to their families. Nothing prepares you for that kind of death. As nurses, we just talked amongst ourselves. There was a lot of sadness and frustration. We wanted the war to end just like everyone else. And these are lasting realities that Gram carried throughout her life. The other story that she shared with me under extreme caution, which we're going to get into now, was about the atom bomb. And she really, really kept her mouth shut on this for a long time. So when we had this story, even then she was very cautionary about it. Loose lips sink ships, right? But this is what she said. Now, for those who are wondering about the atom bomb a little bit, the dropping of Fat Man and Little Boy, the two atom bombs on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were between August 6, 1945, and on August 9th, 1945. This led to Japan's surrender on August 15th by the Emperor, which once, like we said earlier, was officialized on September 2nd, 1945. Gram worked graveyard shifts as a head nurse, something she had done from the very beginning of her deployment. And one such night, she was working her regular shift, and she happened to gaze out into the airfield from the infirmary. And at a distance, she saw innumerable vehicles and heavy military presence, and they had closed off roadways and stationed heavily guarded postings all over the roads to the airfields. So it really stuck out at night to see all of this activity on the airfield. There was this large flatbed truck with a massive tarp covering the back of the vehicle, and this whole thing was under heavy military escort. It was a massive military convoy that was leading all this onto the airfields, but she couldn't make out what it was. So watching the flatbed vehicle head into the airfield, she wasn't sure what she was seeing at the time. She said, quote, "With security like that, it was evidently a top secret thing. But I didn't ask anyone. I knew better than to ask. But it was a big deal, whatever it was." So fast forward to the next morning. She's had her late shift. All the nurses are tired. They're getting ready to at least get some sleep. And she said, but before any of them could do it, they were all ordered. Not just the nurses, but staff and tons of other servicemen and women were out on the beaches digging foxholes. And the thing is, these beaches, regularly, she was very confused by this because the only thing they've known about these beaches was recreation. You know, thinking about it now, this is where they would go to unwind, a place where at least they could have a little bit of silence and peace. But they were digging massive foxholes. Quote, this is what she says. "I thought, what the hell are we doing out here? And why are these holes twice as deep as normal foxholes? Why are we all out here digging these? And are these holes graves? Are we going to be putting bodies into these graves?" No one had the answers, and we were all worried. When things are on a need-to-know basis, who knows what you've gotten yourself into? Unquote. So the following day, a high-ranking friend spoke to her off the record. And Gram says the following. He says to me, "Just listen to the radio tonight. You'll understand that. Well, of course, we heard about the bombs being dropped, and then Japan's surrender following it. It was stunning. We were confused, though. What type of bombs were these? And of course I had no idea what they were. It was only years later that I saw the footage and all the absolute travesty of it and how it affected the people. But Japan was the enemy, and we were at war. I know now that war could bring out the worst in humanity. I saw it in every soldier that we treated. I suppose I was too young to fully understand the war. But I love my country, and I saw what the Japanese had done in Pearl Harbor, what they had done to our soldiers, what they had done to the natives of those islands. I felt very strongly about my country. I loved my fellow servicemen and women. I was proud to serve. But I knew we all pay the price for war. Regardless of the victory, the scars remain." So, soon after the war ended, Gram returned home. She returned to the United States on January 9, 1946. She was later discharged on March 15th of 1946 as a first lieutenant with an honorable discharge. Gram received decorations and citations as following: American Theater Ribbon, her AP Theater Ribbon with 1 Bronze Battle Star, 2 Overseas Service Bars, and a Victory Medal. So Gram was very relieved to be home finally. In these photos here, this is restored on the left. That is Gram actually coming home. So that's her arrival home photo. And on the right is a photograph of her mother, which would be my great-grandma, and my 2 second cousins, waiting on their aunt to come home from the war. So they have the back of the car all decorated for her arrival. I'll have a lot of these photos, but I decided this one would be the best one. So Gram went on to continue her work as a head nurse at the Veterans Administration hospitals and working as a head nurse in many capacities. One of the more longer-term assignments she had was the psychiatric wards. Now, there was numerous stories of her work there, much of which I heard from her fellow colleagues and friends that were no problem sharing these stories with me over letters or phone calls over the years. Many of these individuals have obviously since passed, but her legacy followed Gram well into her golden years, even into her legacy post-death. So I'm going to share only a couple of these stories. She was a very feisty woman, and when I say that, I truly mean this. But this is actually a photo of Gram on the left, and this is within about a year after she had gone back into civilian life out of the military. And on the right, this is my Gram. This photo, I had to go looking for this photo. Gram was very humble about things like this, where she didn't really discuss if she had been in a newspaper or any of that kind of stuff, and she's been in plenty of newspapers with different things that she had been up to, let me say that. But always professional, and this was a photo of her with Roy Rogers. She was wrapping up his foot. He had hurt himself at the state fair. This was actually in Modern Screen magazine, I believe in late 46. So she was tending to his foot. And I had to go hunting for this picture. I didn't even know it existed. I had only heard stories about it. I had been told by her niece about it, so I went hunting. But Gram had a no-nonsense type of personality and a very take-charge work ethic. There are numerous stories about her, but she definitely did not put up with nonsense. Several of the stories I've been told were from different nurses who worked under my Gram for many years at the VA. She was very protective of her nurses, orderlies, staff in general, especially when any of the administrators or doctors attempted to wreak havoc in some way, have a power trip. Gram wouldn't put up with it. And then one example that was told to me was Gram had found out that one of the doctors was mistreating her orderlies in her ward, calling them derogatory names and even yelling at them, because a lot of the orderlies back then were minorities. And he really went out of his way to be a jerk, an absolute jerk, to these orderlies. Well, Gram caught wind of this, and this was uncalled for. So sure enough, when she got wind of this, she had her own war campaign, and thereafter that doctor was removed from her ward. He was not allowed to touch those patients. He was not permitted in that ward. She knew people in administration. I know she did, but she never told anyone how she was doing this type of stuff. Her friend remembered fondly that Gram had a meeting with all the orderlies. She fondly remembered that Gram had a meeting with the orderlies and staff, instructing them to come to her at any time should they ever be mistreated, have any issues with doctors, or anyone else while they were performing their work. She carried a responsibility to her people, her crew, regardless of their race or ethnicity. She viewed everyone that worked in her ward as a team member and a very important piece. Gram had earned the clout, and she had run with it. So to know how she would go about things was very difficult to know. She did the same kind of stuff well into her late years. I'm on the record saying this. She was out of control. As her granddaughter, I'd get phone calls from the head nurses of stuff that she would do. And there will be a part 2 to this of just stories. But this is something that made total sense to me. And I went, yeah, I saw this. When I was being told these stories, I went, yeah. I never would figure out how she'd get things done, but she always did. But God forbid that one of these, while she was working in these hospitals, some hotshot doctor came in and started to mistreat one of her patients. Another one of her friends shared a story who said, we had a few daytime doctors that would come into these psychiatric wards and mistreat our patients. And your Gram worked graveyard shifts then. But when she caught, word of what was going on, she goes, I remember. She stayed overnight well into the morning shift to confront these doctors, each one by one. She had the patient's charts in hand, and she raised so much hell, things immediately changed. No one wanted to cross her. No one dared. She had a misleading patients. They didn't expect this from this woman who seemed very soft-spoken but direct. They didn't think that she could do it, and she did. What you're Grandmother, this is another thing she pointed out. My gram saw these patients, she saw them as individuals who had given their livelihood to serve our country. So to mistreat veterans was incomprehensible to her, especially those suffering with what we now call PTSD. They used to call it shell shock, she went on to say. So mistreating these individuals to Gram was 100% unacceptable. And to a greater extent, I believe your grandmother knew what they were going through because she had seen quite a bit of it already. But it spread quickly among the staff and administration that no one was to mess with your Gram, or she'll come for you. So as a grandmother, Gram was outgoing and loving, and honestly, one of the nicest people you would ever meet. Most of my friends that met my Gram when she was alive loved my grandma. Like, she had that kind of personality where she was everybody's grandma. It didn't matter what someone's race was or your ethnicity, she was your grandma. Like, I can't tell you all the stories that, like, after she died especially, people that came to see me or called me or tried to get in touch with me through mutual because of my Gram. They came out of the woodwork just being like, she was like my grandmother, she was like my mom. And she took them under her wing. And even though she was an older lady, she made her presence known. She believed that people could take responsibility for themselves to the best of their ability. She knew that people had the potential to be great doctors, nurses, priests. Stories about priests, that's a long story. But Gram had an impact on everyone in that way. She didn't believe in doing handouts to people, but she believed in showing support and love towards others. You know, God helps those who help themselves, right? That was one of her favorite quotes. But she knew that sometimes you needed to lift up. She understood that there were obstacles that life could present, but she knew there was always a way around those obstacles. She had her enemies. Oh yeah, make no mistake, she was not perfect by any means, and she definitely had her enemies. But she made a tremendous impact on me growing up as a young adult, young child, all the way through from when I was little. She helped raise me. She was there, she was like my mom. She was the other mom. And I could go to her about pretty much anything, even if she was the one giving me a dirty look, or an occasional, like, death threat, with love. But it is what it is. She was a strong woman in every sense of the word, breaking stereotypes without the need for the fanfare. She was humble, more than most people realize, with such like an open personality. There was a lot of things she didn't share. But Gram encouraged me to learn from her mistakes and to live authentically. I could share hundreds of stories of things that she's done, and it was well into her older years, but at the end, her legacy carries on in everyone that knew her. And age did very little to deter that spirit. And she definitely touched lives. I was very lucky to have her until my mid-20s. She passed at 88 years old from natural causes, and that loss was very difficult for me. But I'm grateful that our relationship naturally evolved from that grandparent to a friend type relationship. I was blessed to have a grandmother, a mentor, and a best friend wrapped up into one person. And I'm grateful I recognize that to this day, because not everyone gets to know their grandparents. But I hoped you have enjoyed this segment of my tribute to my Gram Squirrel. There will be a part 2, which I mentioned earlier, and it'll be a conversation between myself and her great-grandson, who knew her and had a relationship with her eldest squirrel. And we'll be sharing some stories about her character and the notoriousness. Oh my gosh. So many stories that you think about. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot she did that. Oh yeah, now I remember. And they're never for the faint of heart. So that's why it's separated. But the reasons for remembering history is always of a cautionary tale. isn't it? We can remember the heroics and the wonderful things that happen with like war stories. But there's always a debt and a price of war. In war, there are no real true winners, only the ones they write about in history books. As proud as we are of Gram Squirrel and any other family members we have that have served, she never presented World War II as a magical event, a blind patriotism, but rather a time of change, inner reflection, and the lasting impacts of war, remembering those who couldn't come home. Now, these lasting impacts continue to this day, and this war presented the world with great atrocities, things that we still look at and wonder how the hell it happened, to great acts of bravery and heroic deeds. But one thing is for certain, these things will forever linger in history books, but it's the stories like Gram's that should be shared. And this is what challenges new generations to pay attention to. Thank you to everyone who listened and hung out with me a little bit as we went on this, I guess, memory lane with Gram. And this is only just a small piece of who she was as an individual and the impacts that she's made. But I feel like it was very important to share her story on this anniversary, especially with such a rough year as 2020 has been. It's a time of reflection and a time to honor those that we loved that served. And with all of the things that are going on in this country, the most important thing for me is family. As many other people too, family is important. And that involves everything we're experiencing right now. But please keep history alive. And share your stories, because every story educates and informs a new generation of those who are no longer with us. I want to thank you all for hanging out, and I will talk to all of you again soon.